we continue to see a disturbing trend of increased gun violence, and we continue to see more victims impacted by gun violence. The Seattle Police Department continues to focus on identifying hotspots that will allow us to reduce these disturbing trends.
Well, that's Seattle Police Chief Adrian Diaz talking about Gun Violence Awareness Day just a few weeks ago. So what's our region actually doing about reducing gun violence? And what role is the Seattle City Council going to play in that process? Plus, what needs to change in the police inquest process after a difficult but perhaps predictable decision in the Charlena Lewis case? And what's the council doing about those food delivery service fees you're paying? Well, we are discussing that and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are my own. And I am joined by David Croman, who is the transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. But, David, I got to say, it's like we're pulling you in for one last job. I saw your byline on some coverage of a local political race for the 34th District. Are you going to be doing more of that political reporting, or what's up?
No, I don't think so. It's there's a lot of primary races to cover, and they need a lot of hands. And the Olympia reporter Joe Sullivan just left and joined my old employer at Crosscut, so they need a few hands for some political coverage. So I was happy to jump in, but
awesome,
no, I don't think it's going to be a regular thing.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Well, thanks. It's in my district, so it's always good to know that got you on my side, man. Thank you. Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to all of our listeners. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Catch them on the first floor of City Hall. Thank you, John. Hope you're hanging in there. Thanks also to our patrons. Hoping to see more of you join us on Patreon to support the show. We have a number of patrons helping us out. Our Mug Club patrons, always the coolest. They support us at the $10 level, and we feature their photos on the show with the quality name drop. How about a shout out to Tom this week? Looks like a lovely mug al fresco shot there on the bistro table outside. Why not? Enjoy that mug out there. A beautiful summer unfolding before us, finally. Thank you, Tom. Thanks to all of our patrons. And if you are a listener, please do support the show, Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thanks to Converge Media. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's light this candle. It's time to get going with Right Here, Right Now. This week, in front of the Seattle City Council, we're going to see a presentation from King County Public Health on a regional approach to reducing gun violence. This is in front of the Public Safety Committee. So this is an approach that the county started last year, and I'll touch on that approach in a minute. But first, I want to look at the challenge here, David. Shots fired in King County in 2021, up 54%. The number of overall shooting victims up 70% over the 4-year average of 2017 to 2020. And David, I got the impossible question for you here. Is it the pandemic? Is it political unrest? To what do you attribute this rise in gun violence? Because it's not just here in King County.
Yeah, like you said, if I could answer that question confidently, I'd probably have a different career. But yeah, I mean, whenever something, there are national trends like this, it's hard to kind of pinpoint it on a single location. Sometimes it's politically expedient to do that, but it is, as you said, a nationwide surge that we're seeing in gun violence. So, you have to think that, and it's not just gun violence, it's, all other sorts of crime also has gone up. You have to think that, if you look at what is the common denominator for the whole country, it is the pandemic. So you have to think that at least has something to do with it. Of course, fentanyl deaths are also going way up. And so that may have something to do with it as well. A lot of financial struggles out there. So, I'm sure it's a mix of things, but certainly I think you can't exclude the pandemic as a factor.
Absolutely not. But just getting to this public safety approach, I thought this was really interesting to learn about it. The city's learning more about this today, the Regional Peacekeepers Collective. So the RPKC, as it's called, is actually connecting with young people who are in the emergency room for gun-related injuries, hospital intervention here. Harborview has about 100 to 150 people between the age of 16 and 24 coming in with gunshot wounds every year. The RPKC is in the hospital actually talking with them. So these are the people, the young people, who are at most at risk to be involved in future gun violence cases, according to the county prosecutor's office. And I guess I wanted to ask you, David, about this. What do you make of this public health approach to the issue of gun violence here? I think it's very interesting. And I guess the other impossible question here is it going to work?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to work, but it is, I mean, I think what a lot of local politicians would love to do is pass really stringent gun
Right.
control measures, but they can't do that because the state has preempted. There's a preemption on local governments from passing kind of major gun control bills. So
Right.
really, only the state can get involved in gun policy specifically, and so that leaves local governments with a few options, which is the law enforcement side. How does law enforcement respond to these things? And then
Hmm.
the public health kind of community outreach side. How do you connect with people who are most likely to be involved in gun violence and kind of disrupt that
Yeah.
that pattern, as they say? So I don't know if it's going to work, but it is it is one of, frankly, not that many tools that local
Yeah.
government has to kind of change this trajectory.
Right, and change the discussion too. I've seen it compared in some ways, David, to this idea of look how public health improved car safety, for example. There are laws in place now for seatbelts, et cetera. You can actually make a direct line to say, okay, when these public health improvements went in, look what happened here in terms of reducing deaths and injuries. I think that the gun connection is a little more difficult to make, but can you make that connection between public health and potentially making an impact on gun violence? Because I think that's the overall effort that's going on here.
Right. Well, the seatbelt example is an interesting one because I would actually think that is more analogous to, say, gun control,
Okay,
because
okay.
seatbelts are, it's a policy. It's not really about changing people's minds. It's just the
Yeah,
rule now. You
yeah,
have to wear
yeah.
a seatbelt. So in the same way that, I think advocates for gun control say, it's not it's effective because you don't sort of have to change hearts and minds as much. You just pass laws and sort of restrict how many guns are in the community. So
Yeah.
in some ways, I see some of these outreach efforts as more akin to, public information campaigns around
Okay.
speeding and, sort of trying to get people to slow down. And, and those tend to be a lot harder to measure. And, I think their efficacy is always questioned whether,
Yeah. Slow the flock down. We'll see how
yeah,
those signs
exactly.
go over. We just see those going up. Keep going. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's this debate that I think applies to a lot of issues between, um, kind of making systemic changes, in some ways
Mhm.
taking the choice out of individuals' hands. How do you
I
pass
see.
laws that get to the solution you want without sort of needing to go person by person and convince them to change their behavior?
Right.
Versus, yeah, I mean, kind of more public health campaigns and communications and things like that, which may be effective, but it's just a lot harder to kind of correlate, make a one-to-one correlation between how
Yeah.
effective they are.
You make a great connection there with the gun regulations there. That's a very important part of this. I wanted to move on to something else here with you, David, and talk about something the council's also looking at this week, considering a measure about delivery service fees for food out there, for your Door Dashes, your Instacarts, apps like that. So the council during the pandemic capped those fees at 15%, but that fee is supposed to end when the mayor ends the civil emergency. I'm going to put a pin in that end the emergency conversation for a second. But David, these delivery apps have created this really interesting dynamic. There's a demand for them that keeps on rising, but then the restaurants don't necessarily have a lot of power to negotiate on what that delivery price should be. Does having a delivery service help or hurt local restaurants? What do you think about that?
I don't know. I think that's a good question. I think it certainly seemed to help, at least in the early part of the
Yeah.
pandemic, because it was a way for these restaurants to get food out. But I remember early in the pandemic, my wife and I ordered something in, and from Uber Eats, I think. And when it showed up, the restaurant had included a note saying, "Hey, next time you want to order from us, just call us directly,
Mm,
and we will send this to you." Because, I obviously, restaurants have a choice; they don't have to participate in food delivery, but they do because I think it is
it's a
profitable.
big part of the
But
market now too. Yeah.
exactly, but they also get pretty hammered by some of these fees
Yeah.
in what is already a low margin business. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for
Yeah.
these restaurants. Is the sense that I get.
I think so too, and it's interesting. The council is talking about this permanent cap of 15%. Four other cities in the U.S. have done this: Minneapolis, NYC, Philly, San Francisco. But it's really interesting here because the apps are saying, okay, we'll do that 15% limit, but if you want your restaurant optimized during a Google search, for example, or if you want any sort of advertising at all, then your cost is going to go up a little there, Mr. Restaurant. And so it's interesting to me. It's kind of a sneaky one here. Restaurants, do they need to invest in these other services to stay viable as restaurants? I think that's a part of this too.
Yeah, I agree. For me, the hardest thing about these debates is the companies are they don't often provide a lot of evidence for their claims of what,
Right.
maybe, they say, well, okay, if you do this, then we're going to be forced to raise prices. But I, as a reporter, I've encountered this with these companies where they say things, but they don't always provide the data to back it up. So it could very well be true, and they say it's all proprietary, and that's why. But it's these debates are challenging because I don't know that everybody is functioning with the full information of like what the impact of this actually is.
Right. Right. And one last piece to touch on here. This whole idea of the 15% cap the city has in place right now ends at the end of the mayor's declared civil emergency. Do you think the city might be signaling that we are seeing an end to this civil emergency on the city side? I just wanted to throw that out there because I was thinking about that. And yeah, we've been dealing with this for 2+ years. Is this some sort of signal for us?
I don't know. I do think it is preparation. This is both a state and city thing. Of course, the Republicans at the state level are clamoring for Governor Inslee to end his state of emergency.
Right. Yep.
But at the same time, we've also seen that we've been in a homelessness state of emergency since 2015. So we have seen that the city is basically okay with being in a perpetual state of emergency. I think it works out because for the most part, obviously the city council and the mayor have disagreements, but I don't think anyone is, and the city council is too concerned that Bruce Harrell is going to become a dictator with his powers. But it does raise an interesting question around setting limits on these things. And, so anyway, that was sort of a tangent, but I don't have an answer to that. I think for Mayor Harrell, there's probably still some things that are easier to do under a civil emergency than not. Right. And so unless he's not getting a ton of pushback. I'm not hearing a lot of people saying he needs to end this right away. So, I think it will be as late as possible that this civil emergency would end.
Yeah. A lot going on with that for sure. Thank you for that, David. All right. Well, coming up, we have a new inquest process for police shootings. Did we get closer to a sense of justice using that process in the Charlena Lewis case? We're going to break it down on Now Hear This. A challenging moment last week for our community as the inquest process investigating the shooting death of Charlena Lewis by Seattle police ended with a jury deciding that officers were justified in shooting the 30-year-old pregnant mother for coming at them with a paring knife. Her family reacted with frustration and anger, as you might imagine. Here's a few things they had to say.
Just so sad, and my grandkids don't have a mother, and then they didn't get no justice at this inquest.
I was hoping that this process was going to change my mind, that I wasn't going to think that you murdered my cousin and that you maybe had other options, but you murdered my cousin and you had several other options.
David, just watching this inquest unfold, it became clear to me that the focus of it was limited. It was set up to look into the frame of mind of the officers at the time of the shooting, and not as much Charlena Lewis, who had a history of mental health issues. I guess for me, I was not surprised at this outcome. Were you, out of what happened with this inquest?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. I think at the end of the day, an inquest is asking a question about whether or not what happened was basically what was within policy and what police have been trained to do. And I think that was the answer to that was yes, it was probably by a while ago. I mean, the Seattle Police Department concluded that. That is a completely different question, though, than whether or not that training is proper or whether there were other avenues that could have been taken to avoid this death. And I think this kind of highlights that disconnect between what is like technically justified versus what people who have lost a loved one see as morally justified.
Right. And I know we had a different inquest process here. Compelling the officers involved to justify their actions to actually testify is different. We haven't seen that before, an important change to this. But I did want to follow up on that whole idea of what other changes need to happen, because I was really struck by a message from the attorney for the Lewis family, Karen Kohler, who wrote that the family doesn't blame the jury for its decision. However, and here's the quote, The message is clear. If a person is in a mental health crisis and has any type of sharp-edged instrument, tool, or weapon, do not expect them to survive if 911 is called in Seattle. And I guess that bigger question for me is, will this inquest lead to some changes in SPD policy? I think that's the root of this for me.
Yeah, same. And I think that was always how it was going to end up. And this question, I don't cover police so much anymore, but this question of police response to someone with a knife, and specifically someone in a mental health crisis with a knife, is for me, for my money, the kind of trickiest and most fraught scenario. And it seems to be the occasion in which people get shot and killed kind of the most often. I can think of a few examples off the top of my head. Just in Seattle, there's Derek Hayden, the guy downtown, Terry Caver, I believe his name was, the guy in Lower Queen Anne. These are a few examples of somebody in a mental health crisis holding a knife. And I just think that's always going to be, because that in police world is still seen as a threat to the officer's safety. They're not quite as dogmatic about it, but there is still this kind of pervasive view that if somebody is within, I think it's 12 feet with a knife,
they can get at you within seconds. Yeah.
There's a lot of, where that number comes from and whether or not that's actually true is, a big topic of debate.
Right.
And it's not taught as much now, but it is something that still exists in police mindset. And so then you get this situation where you have a basically 100-pound pregnant woman with a knife getting shot by two burly police officers. And it just, you can understand why people are confused how that is the end result. Why it's such a imbalance of power. And it's this woman who is clearly in a mental health crisis who's the one who ends up dead. And so, the police have talked about these, nets that they can deploy to wrap people. There's a few tools that they have talked about.
Right.
But, I think really that gets at this trickier question of, at what point does kind of officer's sense of safety supersede, the person that they're responding, when does that justify actually shooting somebody?
It's big. And I'm glad you brought up that part about the net, David, because it was interesting to hear from the jury, because we had that deal where the officer did not have his taser, didn't have it. But the jury said even if the officer had that taser, it probably would not have been the right response here with a knife coming at them. And I know this is something that all police departments across the country are dealing with. And I think you're speaking to this. The OPA has looked into this here in Seattle, and I don't know if they have any answers either. This is almost a national discussion about what do you do when somebody has a knife like that, because it can be a deadly weapon. Officers' lives can be in danger here. What do you do about it? I feel like it's a broader discussion than way beyond Seattle here.
Yeah, I think the answer is time and space, which is you kind of do everything you can to make a secure environment, and you get behind a car and you get people who might get hurt out of the way.
Yep.
That's why I'll be, in some ways I'll be very curious to see how the Derek Hayden, I wrote about this when I was at Crosscut, but I'll be very curious to see how the Derek Hayden case plays out, because that, to me, this was a guy who was in an open environment, and the police showed up and shot him within, less than a minute.
Yeah.
When it, by all appearances, it appeared they had the opportunity to create that space and to back off and to stand behind cars. And so, in the Charlena Lewis case, the officers have argued that, they were in this hallway, so they didn't have the opportunity to do that. Of course, the family disputes that, and there's some questions about where the officers were actually positioned and kind of whether they could have given that space. But yeah, the Derek Hayden one, to me, really stands out as an opportunity where it, to my view, it seems fairly clear they had the opportunity to do that and didn't. And so, yeah, I mean, when it comes to knives and people in mental health crisis, that space and time thing is really, really important. Because you have to think that it's a temporary state of mind that these people are in, that given the opportunity, it will pass. But sometimes these things happen so quickly that opportunity never comes up.
Yeah, and there are going to be more of these inquests happening as King County starts to use this new system going forward. So we'll definitely see what's going on there. Thank you for that, David. I wanted to move on to something else here. An interesting development this week. Councilmember Andrew Lewis on the Seattle City Council is discussing the idea of putting ranked choice voting on the November ballot, along with the approval voting measure that recently got enough signatures to get there. So, backstory here, folks. When an initiative gets those signatures, the council can pass it as an ordinance, bypassing the voters there. Let it sit, which puts it on the ballot, or even reject the initiative and approve another measure to compete with it on the ballot. I think I've confused everybody there, so we're in good shape. But David, this story gets in the weeds really quickly, but my basic take is you got ranked choice voting. Voters rank candidates in the order of preference, and then you get a majority in that way. Approval voting, you vote for as many as you want, and the top two get through. What do you make of what the council is trying to do here? Some thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is interesting because I think this kind of gets into, usually this kind of vote to put something on the ballot is sort of a pro forma thing to kind of, it would be very notable if they opted against voting to put something on the ballot, because it's really just a technicality to prove that, yes, okay, the signatures were gathered and we're going to put it on this ballot. But the fact that Councilmember Lewis is talking about putting this other kind of counterbalancing proposal on the ballot, I think I saw the person who's pushing for approval voting grumbling about this because viewing it as putting the council putting their thumb on the scales, opposing this. The difference between the two is subtle but important, because the opponents of approval voting argue that what it does is it basically further empowers the people who are already empowered. So, city races, we almost always see kind of one more, moderate choice of the people who live on the waterfront, North Seattle in some ways, and then kind of one more progressive, people who get a lot of votes from Beacon Hill and Rainier Valley and stuff like that. But in an approval voting scenario, those people who vote in blocks, namely the waterfront people, would theoretically kind of have the power to advance two preferred candidates into the general election. And so I can understand why those folks are concerned. Ranked choice voting in theory would maybe do a better job of advancing kind of a diverse slate of people to the general election, but I think there are a lot of questions about that also. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting political maneuver on the part of the city council, because that to me reads that they're concerned about approval voting actually passing.
And they've actually gotten some support from Fair Vote Washington, which is emerging as the ranked choice voting supporter here that is going to be trying to put this through at the Seattle City Council level here. And I talked with Logan Bowers on this program last year about this, or excuse me, a few months ago about this, just what's happening with this whole idea of approval voting. I think his case, and he's put this forth to a few more people, it's a little easier to understand for people as opposed to ranked choice voting. And I think that's the bottom line for me here. I think the idea of trying to get more candidates through, that sounds great, but also the idea of not confusing voters anymore is a big part of this too. Do you see that, David?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to a certain extent. I think that also does assume that voters aren't able to kind of brush up on process. And I do think that ranked choice voting it's not a fringe thing anymore. I mean, there are states, I think Maine, I think New York now has ranked choice voting. So it is, Australia, I'm pretty sure does. This is not a thing that is totally out of nowhere. So I think he's right on the one hand, and on the other hand, I do feel confident that voters would have the resources at hand to kind of educate themselves on how this actually works.
Right. Well, there is some education that's going to be going on here, and there are a few cities around the country who actually have approval voting as well. So this is something that's shaping up into an interesting discussion here this week on the Seattle City Council, and could definitely be an interesting discussion this fall once the ballot comes around. All right. Up next, are you changing your commuting habits with gas prices going through the roof? Well, you're not alone. We're going to break it down on Transportation Talk. David, you had a story recently in the Seattle Times about gas prices, how they're affecting how a lot of us get around. What did you find out?
Yeah, I mean, as you might expect, we're seeing less fuel consumption, which it's a little hard to kind of do an apples to apples comparison
Yeah,
because, of
always.
course, the pandemic screwed up so many data stories for all of us, because you now have to caveat every data story with saying, well, with the exception of early 2020 when everything changed.
Right.
But regardless, there was this trend line after the pandemic of fuel consumption kind of going up, and it was fairly consistent until late last year, kind of early this year, when gas prices started to go up too. So, as maybe you'd guess, people have been taking steps to avoid driving as much. And I think one thing that we've seen is more people trying out bike riding, especially as the summer comes around.
Sure. Yeah.
More people trying e-bikes. The demand for electric vehicles is for people who can afford them is pretty well through the roof. And we were also seeing the trend lines on transit. Well, of course, transit has not recovered it really that even close to pre-pandemic levels. It is improving month over month. It's going up, whereas gas consumption is going down. So there are a few indications that people, it's always hard to track individuals and how they're changing their behaviors, but there are some indications that people are actually changing their habits in response to gas prices.
I guess it's right. So you can't just say, okay, when it went up 10 cents, we saw, this amount of bikes start going or something like that. It's just really difficult to track it sounds like.
Yeah, it is difficult to track, but I do think that there's enough circumstantial evidence that suggests that people are sort of trying out different things. Then, of course, there are industries where like diesel, for example, of course, is like $1 more expensive than even regular right now. It's through the roof, but a lot of people who use diesel, namely truck drivers, can't drive less. And as someone from the Trucking Association told me, if there is a fuel efficiency step to take, it has already been taken. That even before gas prices, they do everything they can to use as little gas as possible. So, of course, it's impossible for some industries and some people to change habits. But, I think we're seeing fewer people take long road trips, people biking more, of course, and then of course, remote work is still kind of stuck around. So maybe people just saying, all right, I'm going to go in twice a week instead of 3 days a week. So yeah, I mean, it's all fairly intuitive when you think about it, but there are signs that, there's some data at least to back it up.
Interesting piece, David. Thank you for breaking that down. I wanted to talk about something else interesting as we wrap up here. You tweeted recently about how great it feels when the Mariners sweep the Toronto Blue Jays. What is it about beating up on our kindly neighbors to the north? They're such courteous fans, but man, it feels good to sweep those guys. Some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, it's because they actually, this is purely in the realm of friendly sports rivalry. I am genuinely actually impressed and respect how well they are able to organize their fan base in Vancouver to get down here.
Yeah, I know it's like half. I went to a couple games in the series there. At least half Blue Jays fans at the field. And amazing.
I remember a couple years ago, before the pandemic, I was in Pioneer Square and seeing just a line of tour buses cruising through. So these aren't just individuals coming down. I mean, they are actually organized. And when you go to Canada, you might think that Vancouver, they'd have some Mariners fans, but when you go to Vancouver, BC, nobody's rooting for the Mariners. The Blue Jays are Canada's team.
It's the only one they have, since Montreal left. So
and so of course, it makes sense that when there is an opportunity to drive 3 hours to go and see their team, then they'll take that opportunity. But that's not to say it doesn't annoy the crap out of me, even if I do kind of quietly respect it.
Yeah, no, and it was great. The fans, I was sitting behind you, and I'm up there booing George Springer, who was on the Astros, and a liar and a cheater and all that stuff, stealing signs. So I'm like, boo. And like, oh, he's a good guy. No, he's a really good guy deep down. So it was some good conversations had there with the Canadian folks. Hey, I'm not going to apologize for that sweep because it was awesome to watch. We'll have to see what the Mariners do here going up to and after the All-Star break. Some exciting stuff when you win 8 in a row. Well, David, thank you as always for making this happen with me. Thanks to the Mariners for winning some games. It's been fun to watch. Thanks for everybody who's listening out there at Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all those major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please support the show on Patreon. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.